I came to my father's wedding without too much pathos. No gifts with bows, no fancy dress, just a blue, comfortable dress that I could wear to work. Why waste energy on spectacular appearance, if you know perfectly well that your place in this family plays somewhere in the masses, at the door for staff? There was a huge board of cards in the lobby, as if we were all lottery participants. I found my last name quickly. Table 14. The arrow on the chart pointed to the far corner of the room, next to the door through which the waiters take the dirty dishes out. That's nice. Probably to make me feel closer to the action. Susan materialized nearby as a commentator with the right tone. We had to prioritize, Martha, she said, stretching the words as if it were a compliment. Richard stood a little to the side, picking at the cuff of his shirt. He didn't even make eye contact, just glanced over my head, like I was a piece of furniture that had been moved but wasn't being discussed. I carefully put the card back in the box. Thank you for making it so easy, I said flatly without a smile, and turned to leave. The street smelled of wet asphalt and flowers from the wedding arrangements, which had already begun to wilt. I walked along the gravel, got into the car and turned on the air conditioner. My hands trembled slightly, not from anger, but from a strange lightness. The phone in my bag was silent, and I knew it would be that way for the rest of the evening. The way home was through familiar streets, and my memory decided to plant a pleasant memory. I'm 12. Richard's garage is a holy place. He and Josh are counting the proceeds from the lemonade he was selling outside the stadium. That's the business side of things. He praises his son. He nods to me. Martha's minding her own business. That business back then was me washing dishes after their business. I'm 17. Graduation dinner. I'm sharing my plans to go into nursing. Richard cuts the steak and doesn't look up. Well, someone has to do it. Now that's encouragement. He could have just said, good for you. But why when you can hint that it's a choice for people with no ambition? 24 years old. Night shift at the station. He calls not to ask how I'm doing, but to discuss investing in Josh's project. You realize this is scale. It's not like... He stops talking, but I can hear the end of the sentence hanging in the air. I reply, I have patience. He sighs. Of course you're busy. The evening after the wedding, I stop by the 24-hour laundromat. It always smells like laundry detergent and other people's stories. While the drum spun my uniform, I pulled out my notebook and wrote down, no special seats at the table, so no more room in me for this. Back home I took off my shoes, put them neatly in a box, and tossed the flowered rubber band given to all the guests into the trash. Sometimes getting rid of the little details is more pleasant than the big problems. Sometimes silence is louder than any explanation. That night it was deafening. I remember as a kid, Richard always said that respect had to be earned. The problem was that in his mind respect wasn't about human treatment, it was about a bank account and the number of zeros in it. If you don't bring home stacks of money or big titles, you're somewhere in his value system between a mailman and a man who hands out flyers on the subway. It's funny, but he's always prided himself on being able to read people. Only he never seemed to read his own mistakes. With Josh it was simple. Every step he took, even a complete failure, was presented as an experience. My success, on the other hand, was considered something of an accident, something that shouldn't be talked about too loudly, so as not to embarrass the real professionals. I remember him once saying, "You work in a hospital? That's wonderful. It's free patients training." I nodded and thought to myself, yes, and free training in not reacting to stupidity. Susan, by the way, is a master in the art of being dismissive with a smile. She'll never tell you to your face that you're superfluous. She'll just put you where no one will see you. For example, at table 14. All with the look of a man who has just solved the world's problem. In the car, I looked in the rearview mirror and saw there not my reflection, but some shot from a cheap TV show. The main character driving away while everyone dances in the background. Only in my case, this show had long ago been not about love and reconciliation, but about survival in a family where you are perceived as a service. At one of the stoplights, I caught myself thinking about work. We had a new post-op patient due in tomorrow. I knew I'd have to stay late to check all the appointments because in these cases, trusting just the paperwork is like hoping Richard will one day say, "I'm proud of you." In the laundry room, while the drum rattled and the water mixed with the powder, I watched the people. An elderly woman was neatly folding her husband's shirts. A young boy was reading a book while his uniform was being washed. Everyone was minding their own business, and no one needed to pretend they were the perfect family. The notebook entry came out snaggy but clear. I even underlined the words "no room," so I wouldn't forget exactly how I felt in that moment. Not anger, not resentment, but exactly the lack of space in their plans, in their coordinate system, in their priorities. When I left the laundry room, the air seemed fresh, though it smelled like gasoline from passing cars. I caught myself thinking that, for the first time in a long time, I didn't have to make excuses for why I was leaving. I just left. And that was it. At home, I turned on the light in the hallway, set my bag on a chair, and walked into the kitchen. The kettle was rumbling and I poured myself tea, thinking that perhaps the greatest liberation is when you stop expecting someone to come after you to bring you back to the table. I sat by the window with my mug, looking out at the occasional car lights. The city had a life of its own, and in that life there was room for a silence that required no explanation. That evening I realized that sometimes silence is not emptiness, but a clear space in which you can finally breathe. I finished my tea slowly, as if each drop solidified my choice. Sometimes it's in little things like that that the most important thing is hidden. You're finally no longer a backup player in someone else's game. What happened next changed everything. You don't want to miss how it unfolded. I've always known that the silence after family events is temporary. It's not the kind that drags on and gives you a chance to forget. No, in our family, pauses are only necessary for someone to figure out how to use you for business again. Cousin Paul got through first. There wasn't a hint of apology in his messages, just a dry, "We need to talk." And a little later, "He's in the hospital. He needs a man." I replied simply, "I can't. See your doctor." No smiley faces, no "sorry I can't make it." It's not like I'm canceling a coffee shop appointment. It's like I'm giving up my role as free staff. A week later, Susan showed up at the clinic where I was working, standing at the counter as if she'd come to pick up a restaurant order, only instead of a bag of food, she had a phrase. "That's your father. You're not gonna leave him alone." I looked up from the procedure logs then. "Prioritize better, Susan." Recognition flashed across her face. She remembered exactly what she'd said to me at the wedding. "Don't overreact, Martha," she hissed. "We're family. You're family when it saves you money." I closed the magazine and turned to my coworkers. "Please don't keep me, I have patience." I watched Susan walk away, leaving behind a trail of expensive perfume and innuendo. But at that moment I already knew that this fragrance no longer made me feel guilty or want to fix anything. The next step was Richard himself. He called and invited me to dinner to discuss the situation. We met at a small diner where the tables are upholstered in plastic, and the waiters know the regulars by name. He began without foreplay. "You could come in a couple times a week. Just make sure everything's on schedule. It would save us money." I put down my fork and looked straight ahead. "You don't want a daughter, you want a free nurse." He shrugged his shoulders. "Don't overcomplicate it. It's practical. It's practical to pay professionals. Josh is overloaded, he's got projects." "I'm working too," I said. The waiter put the check between us. Richard didn't even touch it. "You've always been independent," he said, as if it were a diagnosis. "I've become this way because I can't be otherwise," I replied. "And it's not a favor. It's my life. I paid for myself, put on my coat, and at the door I said, 'Take care of yourself.'" He nodded, crumpling his napkin. That night I went back to work and replaced a coworker so she could talk to my husband on the phone. Two patients were laughing about how hospital pajamas turn anyone into a character from a slapstick comedy. I joked with them, adjusting the forestand and checking the monitors. Everything was fair here, you do the work, you get the results. Not like in a family where any help you give is automatically devalued if it doesn't fit into their picture of success. A couple days later another message came in. "He's being stubborn. We're all having a hard time." I didn't respond. I made a note in my notebook. My no is not aggression. It's the order in which I live. After the meeting at the diner, I walked down the street for a long time because I didn't want to go home right away. The evening was cold, with the kind of wind that literally blows everything but the main thing out of your head. I thought about how easy it is for them to reduce everything to saving money, and how they have the nerve to call it family care. Care, according to them, is when you do everything and they save money on you. A couple walked by holding hands. I caught myself not envying such scenes anymore. I just knew it was from another life, not mine. In mine, it's the phone calls asking me to switch caregivers, to come over at night, because he's uncomfortable with strangers. All of this is presented as a privilege, as if I've won a lottery opportunity to work for the family for free. The next day, Susan made herself known again. This time a voicemail message where her tone was no longer so confident. She talked about how everyone is really worried, and that I need to be more flexible. I listened to the end, then deleted it. Sometimes the best thing to do with other people's words is to not keep them at all. I sat in the residence room and looked at my notes. A sheet of duty schedules, lists of procedures, a couple reminders to myself. Buy cat food, pay bills. This was my life. Real clear where every item made sense. Not one item on it was about saving Richard's or Susan's reputation. On my way home in the evening, I went to the supermarket. I bought groceries while listening to someone at the next checkout counter arguing about discounts on coffee. Little things, but there's more honesty in these conversations than in all the family councils over the years. At least people aren't trying to cover their interests with concern. Sometimes I think Richard actually understands perfectly well why I disagree. He's just not ready to admit that his value system has failed. In his world, children are supposed to adjust to their parents, not the other way around. And if one of the kids breaks the pattern, he becomes the problem. I remembered one time many years ago when he asked me to help with some home repairs. I took the day off, then came over, spent the whole day hauling furniture, washing windows. At the end he said, "You could clean the stove in the kitchen while you're here." I laughed then, but it was the kind of laugh that comes out to keep from saying something harsh. And now at the diner I realized, this pattern is always repeating itself. At home I put the kettle on, took out a cup, and thought about how much effort we put into living up to other people's expectations, and how quickly that effort comes back when you stop doing it. The tea brewed, I sat against the window and watched the rare cars drive down the empty street. I thought about the phrase I'd said to Richard, "You don't want a daughter, you want a free nurse." It sounded flat, without hysteria, but it had everything I'd wanted to say over the years. Sometimes one sentence is enough to put an end to a years-long scenario. The phone lay on the table, the screen dark. No calls, no messages. And for the first time in a long time, that silence didn't pull me down. Kept me afloat. I knew there was nothing random about this pause. There was just no one else to give orders to. When I went to bed, their words still rang in my head, but without the same power. They were like old posters on the walls. Faded, unnecessary, easily torn off in the first breeze. Richard had always been a man who could make big plans, on other people's shoulders. When I stopped being that shoulder, the structure cracked. First I heard about it from the occasional message from distant relatives. Then from conversations in the clinic hallway, where someone Susan knew casually blurted out, "They're looking for someone cheaper." Cheaper is a key word in our family philosophy. It doesn't matter if it's about the person, their health, their last years of life. The important thing is that there are fewer zeros in the bill. The caregiver they found was a woman in her 50s, with a learned habit of indifference. She did everything by the book. Took her blood pressure, gave her pills, changed her underwear. Nothing more, nothing less. It's amazing how much it reminded me of Richard. Only his indifference was a choice, hers was professional armor. Susan began to come less often. Her visits turned into brief appearances. She dropped in, dropped a few words, checked that everything was in place, and disappeared. And then she stopped altogether. I guess there was no point in pretending they were family without me. Oh, Josh. His contributions were limited to a few phone calls and a couple of checks he never sent. In the end, Richard was left alone with a caregiver, and a stack of bills that grew faster than he could keep up with paying them. Sometimes I thought, this is it, the moment of truth. He built his future home on a foundation of neglect, and now he lives in it alone. Cousin Paul would call me, still with the same message. "He'd like you to talk." I'd say, "No, not now, not let's do it later, but just no." And that no was as solid as the walls of my apartment, where I finally felt safe. One day, as I was coming home from work, my phone vibrated. The message was short. I read it and realized there was nothing in it that required an urgent response. I sat down in the kitchen, poured myself some tea, took out some bread and cheese. I ate slowly, looking out the window at the evening city. Somewhere out there in the distance, people were going through dramas, making plans, arguing and reconciling. And I had tea and silence. Sometimes silence is not the absence of events, but the best possible setting. It doesn't demand anything in return, and it doesn't break down when you stop serving it. Susan left a voicemail. Said, "It's all coming down on her." And then I caught myself listening to her voice and feeling nothing. No anger, no pity. Just emptiness. The same emptiness that I once feared and now cherish because it's mine. Josh wrote one message. "Sorry. We need to settle the paperwork." That was it. That evening I checked my alarm clock, closed my phone and went to bed. Outside the window a rare car hummed, the numbers of the clock glowing in the darkness. I thought about the fact that maybe self-care begins the moment you stop being part of other people's disasters. It wasn't relief or bitterness. It was order. And order is a thing I now hold on to with both hands. After I stopped rising at their call, the days became like a smooth line in a cardiogram, no spikes or calls in the middle of the night. It was oddly pleasant. No one tried to stop by on their way out and leave another request on my doorstep wrapped in a We're Family wrapper. Sometimes, passing by the cafe where we used to meet for family talks, I would see people at the tables discussing someone else's weddings, jobs, vacation plans, and catching myself thinking that my ideal conversation right now is 5 minutes of silence and hot coffee, without commitment and with a smile that hides nothing. The caregiver I learned from a mutual acquaintance didn't last long with Richard. He complained that she was too formal and showed no warmth. It's funny to hear this from a man who himself had years of training not to show warmth even to his own children. Perhaps he just didn't like the fact that formality couldn't be blackmailed by a sense of duty. The bills grew, and the house he had lived in for so many years gradually became a commodity. First there was talk of selling, then ads. I was sent a photo. Bare walls, taped boxes, an orchard where an apple tree had already lost its leaves. There was no Richard in the picture. Just the emptiness where his orderly life had once simmered. Paul called a couple more times. He tried changing tactics from "he misses you" to "you know he's always been like this." That "he's always been like this" sounded like an excuse, but to me it was a verdict. If a person has always been like that, then they will stay like that. I've noticed that the longer I say no, the fewer calls I get. It was as if the very structure of their requests began to crumble because I wasn't backing it up with my consent. This feeling of freedom was unfamiliar, but I was learning not to be afraid of it. In the evening, when the city was quiet, I sometimes went out on the balcony with a cup of tea. The smell of pizza from the neighboring cafe wafted downstairs. People were going about their business, laughing, arguing, someone was arguing into the phone. And it all seemed so far away from the world where Susan and Richard were plotting their petty intrigues. One day I met Susan's former coworker on the street. She was holding a child's hand, and when she recognized me, she hesitated, then said, "I hear you're not helping at all." I smiled and replied, "Right? That's the point." She nodded and we parted ways. Sometimes you don't even have to explain anything. People themselves understand more than they say. The message that the house was sold and Richard had moved to a simpler clinic came over Messenger without further ado. I didn't bother to reply. My life continued in its own rhythm. Work, home, rare meetings with friends. In these meetings there was no room or occasion to tell me about him. When I think of Richard now, I picture an empty room with a bed, a nightstand, and a phone on a charger. Everything else is a set that was taken down long ago. And there is no anger or vengeful satisfaction in that picture. Just a statement of fact. A man left alone with what he himself had built. That night when the short message arrived, I didn't cry or feel relief. I just looked at the screen, turned off my phone, and went to make dinner. The water for pasta was boiling in the pot, and that sound seemed far more important to me than any news. Because it belonged to my home, my life, not their endless dramas. I went to bed early. Snow was falling quietly outside the window, and in that silence I felt that winter had come at the right time. And it was for the best.